thank you all for being here. Really a pleasure. I've never spoken here, so it's wonderful to have taken up this invitation, the invitation from you. Thank Rashmi too, and lovely to see everyone. Many people I know, some I don't, but it'll be fun. So, when Jaya asked me to speak, I asked her, do you want me to talk about my research or about my practice? I tend to live in both those worlds simultaneously. And she said, no, you have to do both. So this is an attempt to do both. And so bear with me because one usually doesn't do both so in such a kind of conjunction. I've called it Architecture in a Time of Flux because I think we are living through particularly transitional times today, and yet architecture has not sufficiently been responsive to these processes of change. It has attempted to stall or interrupt them without translating the energies of transition into concepts and forms that are generative of livable futures. The practice of architecture, I believe, has been obsessed with permanence and stability through imagining absolute solutions. And I think this idea of absolute and transitional solutions is very, very important. To make the shift to transitionary thinking, it would mean recognizing the interconnectedness as well as the unpredictability of social, economic, political, and natural systems to address problems at all levels of the spatio-temporal scale in ways that could make life on our planet sustainable. And simultaneously, architecture in a time of flux should embrace what I call the kinetic, temporary, and the cultures of associative values that people create spatially as also legitimate instruments to imagine cities. And I'll talk about that and the landscapes beyond. A position that regards even the act of conservation as a transitional means to modulate change in society and not an instrument of permanence or the inevitable codification of memory forever. It could also facilitate a redemptive forgetting. Our emphasis must be on nurturing, inspiring, motivating, and mentoring future generations to calibrate and give agency to the otherwise growing schisms between their spheres of concern and spheres of influence. And I think for me as a teacher, this is one of the biggest problems I see in our schools, but also in the profession, where our spheres of concern are expanding exponentially. We talk about climate change, inequity, social justice, but our spheres of influence are diminishing exponentially. And how do you begin to calibrate these at a scale where that instrumentality for the profession can be established? And so what I'm going to do is, So I'm actually going to talk about research and theory, advocacy, pedagogy, and practice in some kind of crazy interconnected way. I hope that actually makes sense eventually. I've broken the talk into really three parts. One is reflections, where I'm going to just share with you nuggets of things I've been thinking about, which I believe now with some distance and reflection have influenced the way we've thought about our architecture, choosing our research and my teaching. And then I'm going to share with you what I call investigations, which are research projects. And the third is propositions, which are projects. So I'm not going to connect my investigations to the projects. I hope it will be implicit. But the lecture is organized in these sections. So the first is rather loose. It's a series of, not random, but it's a series of issues that at different times, and these change with time, but currently these are things I'm thinking about. Investigations is a much more structured sort of section which shows you particular research projects, and propositions is how we take that forward. So in reflections, I want to just reflect about practice, research, what the archives mean, theory and pedagogy, because I believe my sort of involvement goes across this spectrum. And now with time, one has done this intuitively. I'm trying to reflect and make sense and theorize what one has been doing in some ways that might be useful for younger people. So practice is a very capacious word, and I think that's how we should see it. We often are caught in the architecture of practice, we're caught in the practice of architecture. We should be thinking about what is the architecture of practice, and then how do other things sort of nestle within that category. Practice is, this is an interesting sort of definition because it can be a verb or a noun depending on whether you use it in the UK or the US English. I definitely see it as a word, as a verb, one that is very capacious in terms of what it can contain. Research is another sort of category and the practice I went through very quickly because I'll come back to that through the propositions. Research itself, again, I think is worth reflecting on much more in the way we we engage with it, right? Because I'll just go back to practice. Unfortunately, architectural practice is really limited most often merely in defining itself as that area of activity that sees professional architects engaged in design and the construction of buildings, selling their services to clients while complying with the requirements of the professional body. It has to be much more than that, and that's when I think through the lecture one will unfold that. And the way I describe it is often we become thermometers. We say, this is what society wants, these are the bylaws. You kind of get trapped within those confines. You take the temperature of all of that surrounds you. But I think the challenge for us is how can we become thermostats where we can really change that temperature on the way the built environment is constructed. Research is a systematic, creative process of inquiry to discover new knowledge, understand phenomena or solve problems involving careful data collection, analysis, interpretation, often using established methodologies to ensure validity and contribute to a broader understanding. And research itself, I think, has to be interrogated in some ways, and I believe universities around the world are in a crisis in terms of what those research agendas should be. Arjun Appadurai recently wrote a wonderful paper which was on discipline and disciplines in the contemporary university, playing on the word discipline. And really, to quote him, he said, which is, I think, really an interesting framing. He said the university has lost its place in the research world, and what that means is that connections from teaching and training is absolute, right? It's an absolute connection. For example, Google has its own research. It's not looking to universities to take people from universities, but it directs them to what Google wants them to do. So he said we must find a way to share the capacity to generate new knowledge. Almost everybody can be taught how to do an interview, how to define a problem, which is a research problem, which does not include saying the world is going to hell and how can we cure it. That is not a research problem. As a professor, I always had to distinguish when people came to me with a research problem that even God couldn't solve. You have to find a middle range problem which will take 3 or 4 years, a lot of discipline, a lot of effort, a lot of luck, a lot of support, and then you'll have a result. That result will slowly be absorbed. People will not give you a Nobel Prize for it, but you'll get a degree, you might get a job, and if you're lucky in a country like India, it could be applied anywhere in order to tackle a million problems that you have within the diversity of our landscape. So I think research itself as a category we need to interrogate, to define. I'm talking as an architect now, and how could we sort of work with it. I'm very interested these days in the idea of propositional research, which is a research approach where the primary focus is on formulating and exploring propositions. And that's why I called my last section, the projects, I've called it propositions because it's a form of research. It's where there are statements that suggest a potential relationship between concepts, often used in fields where direct empirical testing might be difficult, serving as a starting point for further investigation and theory development. Essentially, it involves exploring theoretical connections between ideas rather than immediately testing specific hypotheses with concrete data. And so that's where it becomes propositional in a sense, where you're connecting many dots and so therefore if you take ideas like this and resituate them in the university through pedagogy, I think it can become much more instrumental for architects. And usually propositional research is used when there are new research areas, when a field is still developing and lacks established theory. Researchers might use propositions to identify potential relationships and guide future research. Complex phenomena in areas where variables are difficult to measure or manipulated, and propositions can be used to explore theoretical connections between concepts. I think that's a whole area that can make research and propel it into a much more productive space. The archive And making an archive, I believe, is as important as a building, and a lot of my work has been about creating archives, because archives create connections to the past, make us aware of what is relevant from the past and be carried over to the future. So they're critical for the construction of our identity, especially in post-colonial conditions like ours, where ruptures have occurred. These are bridges, or instrumentally they're sutures, and sutures is an important word, and that their sutures let the ruptures heal, albeit allowing the memory of the rupture to not disappear fully as a reminder of the potential of its reoccurrence. And so to see archiving as a process of creating those sutures is very, very important. And then, of course, there's theory. What do we mean by theory? This is a wonderful quote by Albert Einstein. He said, theory is when you know everything but nothing works. Practice is when everything works but you don't know why. Scientists combine theory and practice, nothing works and they don't know why, right? So theory itself can become dogmatic. I see even within the institution, people, alluding to theory, alluding to Western theory. Theory is very grounded. Theory is about reflecting on what's happening on the ground. It stuns me that in urban planning, we look at theory that evolved with the industrializing West of the last century. Theory must come out of Africa, must come out of China, must come out of India, because theory is about reflecting and trying to make patterns that can sort of guide us. So really, theory then becomes a critical orientation. It's a moral compass and ways to act. And theory has to be rewritten, it can't be dogmatic. Once it becomes dogmatic, then again it's an absolutism in a way. We can't be nimble in the way we work in this world of flux, right? It's merely to guide us. And I think in the academy, this becomes a very critical question. And that's why this theory is premised on research. And that's why Arjun Apudurai's piece is very important, because if research itself has lost its mooring, what is the theory we are constructing? And so how do you ground theory? Because it is really a moral compass for all us to move. And then pedagogy, I think, is another important question, because this is where theories get embedded, and then what we teach students in terms of how they're instructed and how we prepare them for the world has massive implications. So these were some reflections on these four categories. But then, it's also theory based on where we are working. More people live in that circle than outside that circle. Yet people living in that circle are using theory from outside that circle. It makes no sense. What are the implications when you're in that? So densities are higher, our notion of body space is different, our architecture is different climatically, and all of that. Yet we are using theory from the rest of the world, largely the Western world, where it's constructed in universities, and trying to apply it in places where the ground reality is completely different. Look at India. This is an animated $2 a day, less than $2 a day. We stand out. We should have our own theories about how we can actually respond to that in terms of then how that influences pedagogy. Similarly, we talk of the formal and the informal city. Informality came out of economics, people who are outside the formal economic system. We've applied it and taken it to architecture, and we set up an unnecessary binary. I can bet you what we call the informal city has people who are employed in the formal economy. Some of them have government jobs, they work in offices, and I can bet you a lot of people in the formal cities are incredibly deeply involved in the informal economy, right? And so it's an aesthetic question that makes us create these binaries. Architecture is really about synthesis, about how do you dissolve these binaries. Binaries are a wonderful way to organize the world around us, traditional, modern, formal, informal, etc. But it pushes you as a practitioner often to have your alliance to one aspect of that binary. So you become this architect who's empathetic to the informal city and you work there. But the question is, how do we blur these binaries to create a synthetic condition, which is a kind of third solution. Similarly, climate. I think with the way we are now dealing with climate change as the way we define it, which is kind of this all-encompassing rubric which sometimes means nothing. How do you break it down into really tangible aspects. I mean, for example, I went recently to a very interesting conference which was on climate change, but it just had three verticals. One was on livelihoods, one was on public health, and one was on dwelling. And the argument of the organizers of the conference was these are the three areas that are going to get most impacted actually by climate change, whether it's heat, it's flooding. So when we talk about climate change, we expand our sphere of concern and diminish our sphere of influence versus breaking it down into categories that we can work with. And so for me, this is very appealing. If you look at the tropics, I mean, you know, when the monsoon comes into Mumbai, I mean, it brings both joy and fright because it's going to be disruptive, but then it's elevating the heat, it's bringing water and all of that. So I think the culture of building in the tropics is quite different. And if we begin to construct these rubrics, it's much more productive of how you kind of break it down in ways that are more tangible, where we can actually instrumentalize our own influence. Similarly, climate, if I take that idea of climate further, you know, it's interesting that religion comes out of climate. And so in the tropics, no one tells you to love your neighbor. But in the Middle East, in the harsh desert climate, every religion that has come out of there, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, have the dictums of neighborliness, of helping each other, because you had a harsh climate to deal with, right? And in the tropics, individualism is celebrated, as Hinduism teaches you to reconcile yourself with the self, right? And that's why it so easily now transplants itself in California with all the gurus. But the geography of a place and its climate is actually what propels the tenets of religion. It also propels aesthetics. It's from the Bergman films of, you know, just snow and brooding clouds. The minimalism comes from that. Now we adopt and we make minimalism a style in India, whereas in the tropics, it's nature that's celebrated. We get whether it's our traditional architecture, we get our inspiration from nature because it surrounds us, right? And so therefore this losing the sense of context is really detrimental in the way then we think about architecture, because all of this becomes superficial style and it's not rooted in anything of the place. This is a wonderful painting which was, I think, it's by an artist called Manish Soni, and it was, I think, commissioned by Paul Abraham of Sharmaya, and Ranjit Hoskote displayed them in Goa, which is where I saw them, these. And it was really painting the Isanama. And it really, I was completely moved, because that's the Last Supper. And that's how the Last Supper must have happened in the Middle East, sitting in a courtyard with light on the ground and eating the last meal. That is the Last Supper. The Renaissance has reinvented it. And through that, it finds its way into another imagination, which is aesthetic, a table, sitting in a space, sitting indoors. It's a complete flip of what is maybe authentic in terms of the representation of a particular condition, which draws its inspiration in that Isanama interpretation from place and culture, clearly the clothes, etc. In architecture, we do this all the time in terms of our inspirations without thinking about where something grew out of or where it was rooted. And similarly here, I mean, in this painting, is very inspirational for me, or any of this genre, of the simultaneity of frames, the simultaneity of moments that all occur and coexist, reinforcing each other. And from each one of those sub-frames, you can extract a narrative. Or Gandhi's house, where it's mind-blowingly beautiful for me, because it brings the question of ambiguity. You have the veranda in the front, and you go through that front door into another veranda, which is a completely unexpected moment. And so this notion of ambiguity, which works beautifully in our climate, but it also works beautifully in ways society can organize itself. So for me, inspirational from these two images is the notion of ambiguity, but the notion also of intense simultaneity of the existence of multiple frames that contain multiple narratives, etc. That is a Sir Bannister Fletcher, who was, the ultimate tome on the history of architecture. And you see, Indian architecture, I'm sorry, it's a bad slide, is somewhere at the bottom. We don't get anywhere close to the pinnacle. And it becomes a way of categorization, which is perpetuated then through education, through inspiration to look at the higher orders in a sense. And this is a wonderful sketch and a provocation that Charles Correa made, where he said the Parthenon, which is a freestanding object, it led to Palladio, and then from that came Corbusier, which is where architecture is seen as an autonomous object. It's seen as a bit of sculpture, which is self-standing, and then it commands nature. Is it actually impinging on nature, or is it setting up a new dialogue with nature? We can talk about. But he said, what if the Buddhist caves, which is about subtraction, was the inspiration? Where would that have led us? That is the space within, right? And so therefore, these are two completely different paradigms, so to speak, and we have been inspired clearly by that one. And this is the difference, where the courtyard house gains its symmetry and its identity from the hollow core, which is the courtyard. And the Palladian villa gains its symmetry from the faux exterior and is freestanding in a completely different relationship with nature. These are two completely different paradigms which I think come from the Correa sketch. And these are the ones we are caught with. And you know, which way do you go? We are all going this way, the autonomy of architecture. And you know, the courtyard house, actually, if you look at that drawing at the end, the streets are accretive, they're incremental. Traditional environments grew incrementally, and as they grew incrementally, the symmetry is the courtyard. The outside of the house could be very odd shaped depending on how you adjusted with your neighbors to make your place in that urban fabric. But what you created in the center, the hollow center, was always symmetrical. So it was a space within that we invested our opulence, we invested the symmetry, we invested our connection with nature, not the exterior. And they become two completely different paradigms and perpetuated by the bungalow through colonialism, etc. And then linked to that is, of course, cultural nationalism in the late 20th, early 21st century, where modernization gave us hotels, roads, airports. Cultural history became UNESCO sites, cultural events, national branding, tourism. And as we become more global, traditions become more static. They're seen as being static. You don't have the confidence to evolve them. History, less global and more national. And what gets lost here, I believe, are the middle buildings. What I just showed you, like in that fabric with the courtyards that were symmetric, those are the middle buildings. Our gaze is now locked either on the vernacular, so we look at really crafty, very vernacular architecture and celebrate them, make them into hotels and things, or on high buildings, right? So what has really happened, I mean, if you think about it, any city that you think is a beautiful fabric, whether it's Jaipur, Jaisalmer, or it's an Italian town or a Portuguese town or Lisbon, name it, wherever you feel you love walking and you love the city, what is interesting about it is that 80% of the buildings are background architecture. They don't shout out at all. You arrive at a square and a church stands there and it explodes, right? Or a monument of some kind, or a museum, or something public. But that's about 10 or 20% of the building at the most. The 80% of the building are background. I mean, they're very beautiful, they're repetitive, there's a whole culture that builds that fabric, but it's a fabric. It's integral, it's a fabric. And 20% or 10% of the building are standing out as spectacles, right? What has happened to our cities, Mumbai is a fantastic example, barring the port area perhaps, is now 80% of the buildings want to dance and stand out and become spectacles. We have no background architecture left. That's why it's yet wonderful going down DN Road, because there's a fabric. You see, DN Road is a good example of background buildings. Every building is actually a special building, but they all work together. They are modest enough, or they're quiet enough that the one next to them is not completely impinged. Pettit Library on the corner will have a turret and it'll mark a public building. It's subtle. Fabric is lost now. I think it was Jacqueline Robertson, who was Peter Eisenman's partner. I remember Charles Correa mentioning this statement to me. He said that Jacqueline Robertson said that when we built traditional towns like Jaisalmer or Italian towns, they were like machines with every part doing what it has to do. And he said downtown Houston is like a bunch of spare parts because you don't know what the machine is. So we've lost this completely in the process of not thinking more critically about what is tradition, what are we extending, what is memory, etc. So I think that is the condition. And of course, history itself is a tentativeness. I love Stephen Hawking. I mean, itihas is something different people interpret differently, but even Stephen Hawking said the past, like the future, is indefinite and exists only as a spectrum of possibilities. And so you begin to then get invented traditions, which we have to look at. Eric Hobsbawm talked a lot about it. And these are, I mean, the Ganesh festival is an invented tradition. It's much more recent, right? It doesn't go back deeply as we might think, or another generation might think, that it always existed. And I think it's linked, these invented traditions are also linked to the nationalism and nation building. And we've got to be kind of critical how we interrogate all of this. And then I call these tropes, and the profession is now full of these. There are tropes of space, there are tropes of architecture, the material tropes, there are practice tropes. Practice tropes are when people celebrate they only work with craftspeople and they don't, I mean, Laurie Baker did it, you know, in the most natural way, in a kind of genuine way. But, and I'm not saying the others don't do it in a genuine way, but they make a trope out of it. But architecture can't be one trope. Architecture is much more complex than that. It can't be a spatial, architectural, or material. It has to be all of that simultaneously. And we tend to construct these tropes for our own identity as a profession. And this is being a bit self-critical, critical also of the profession. And I think this is a scholar called Pedro Levi Bismarck. And he talked about the work of Southerners sitting in their own artificial paradise within their own biospheric universe. What he means is that it's been placed over the layers of underdevelopment poverty since the clients are not poor. So, I mean, again, the tropes, when we look at tradition and we try to make things that look traditional or look vernacular and get obsessed with that, I think if it has a driving force which has to do with climate and innovations in material, I think it has credence. But if it's layered over for rich clients to allude to a form of poverty and underdevelopment, I think we have to be much more critical about it. Because he said, and the same scholar said, he said in some ways it's much easier to practice building in the South. In the North, they're challenged with strict safety codes as well as specifications, liabilities of construction, industrial building materials, components, removed from the punishing regulation and demanding performance standards of the Northern architecture. We in the South have the flexibility of practice that's more appropriate for confronting climate change and achievable sustainably oriented sort of practices. And then he was actually, the scholar was being critical to awards, because there were a number of awards in the larger international gamut that have been given to Southern practices now. And he said it's significant that some of the awards given to Southern practices are more in recognition of their promotion of sustainable values over layers of poverty than the purely architectural and artistic merits of building themselves. So he was just reminding us that you have to be sort of critical of that too. And then, again, I call this the landscapes of impatient capital, because capital is intrinsically impatient. And when you have landscapes that create the landing of capital, make it frictionless, and it can realize its value very quickly. You have Dubai, Shanghai, etc. Look at Mumbai. It gives you resistances to the arrival of capital, which is getting smoother and smoother, unfortunately. But these create very brittle forms. And of course, Dubai, Shanghai, Singapore at one point, these are landscapes of impatient capital that create an architecture of impatient. And you know, architects get desperate, they twist and turn to create identity, but these are buildings that are driven by vendors. The client tells a curtain glazing guy, how fast can you do it? They say 6 months, you got the contract. Then the poor architect has to work with those materials and then twist and turn it a little bit to give it identity. This is an overstatement, but it really gives you, this is no place, this is from the HSBC ad, I think, where they collaged everything. Whereas I think what I call the kinetic city is what you see there. The kinetic city is a city where architecture is not the central spectacle of the city. Festivals, it's the static and the kinetic city that work together, and they actually depend on each other for their own image making. Here, architecture is not the single spectacle. Instead, festivals and other foras become the spectacle, and they allow the subalterns to create a forum for self-expression, both cultural and political. In Mumbai, for example, the Ganesh festival is one example, and as that clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain public memory as static and permanent, as a static and permanent entity. The kinetic city, obviously, I argue, cannot be seen as a design tool, but rather a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, ambiguous enough to allow the kinetic quality of the city to flourish. The soft city and the hard city, they have to work together. The city cannot be represented only through statistics and maps, which is unfortunately what is driving a lot of our planning. It's abstract. It doesn't take into consideration associative values, the temporal, which is what changes with time, and the way people really occupy space. And so this is a wonderful article I saw, which is Lalu Prasad in all his wisdom, when we liberalized the economy and there were malls being built everywhere. He said we can't sell shoes in showrooms and food on the footpath, which is really emblematic of what is happening in India. It's ironic, and it will only come from Lalu. And so this whole idea of think global, act local, I think has much more traction today than it ever had when it was first invented as a term. And I think we need to sort of look at these contradictions. It is really remarkable. I mean, our markets are wonderful, the vendors are wonderful, but then they sit in front of an air-conditioned mall where shoes are being sold. The irony of this thing is just so mind-boggling. If we become blasé to it because we see it as we live, we just become blasé to it, but it's so ironical. I mean, if architecture and the environment reflects society, I wonder what historians will talk about when they look at our cities at this moment. And so my formulation is that I think for architects, context is very important. I mean, there are teachers in the room. We teach our students how do you read the context and how do you make your architectural context, right? That means you look at the climate, you look at materials, you look at resources available, and from all of that you craft a position of understanding the context and then you build in it. I would think that based on all the observations I just shared with you, I think that's not enough. I think we have to be much, much more ambitious. Because I think what we have to do is we have to nestle that reading of the context in its context. That is, that there is a broader context. I might look at a site and I might look at its surrounds and I might make the readings of material climate. That's not enough. There are other forces acting on that site, and that is the context of the context. And I think by nestling the context in its context, we can potentially, I believe, create a more nuanced and productive reading of the sites of our interventions. And so these are kind of meta-narratives that you have to create of clarifying the context in which the context of our operation sits. And I think it's very useful as an instrument to imagine a precise range of potential interventions for architects and other design professionals. This is then the space where I believe where architecture intersects with the broader social, political, economic, and cultural landscape, right? So, I mean, for example, when we liberalized our economy, now, we are a liberal economy, and we move into importing materials. We began to be subsumed by the tyranny of images. It seemed like a clean break. We were moving into a new period. But actually, that transition doesn't happen overnight. You don't switch it and you go. And my colleague Yves Blau, who is a historian who looks at East Europe, Baku and places like that, she argues that actually transitions are simultaneous, which means when we transition out of a socialist system into a capitalist or a neoliberal system, for many years, if not decades, we will be transitioning out of socialism, but we'll be simultaneously transitioning into capitalism. And that is what our environment around is about. They are values that many people yet hold of a socialist era. They are parts of the government that does that, did it for decades. Now we are 30 years into our liberalization or whatever. So this simultaneous transition results in something else, in a third space. And how do we as architects begin to read, interrogate, research, archive that condition to see how viable and how we can carefully sort of intervene in those spaces. So the meta-narratives are about clarifying the context of the context. It's a space, like I said, where design intersects with these broader conditions. And this is about rapid geoeconomic integration, uneven spatial development, inequity, which I think for a younger generation will be the biggest challenge, etc. From these contexts and these questions also come the issues of remaking of political identities, the urbanization of poverty, new claims of citizenship, which we, felt in Mumbai many decades ago, but in different parts of India, you yet sort of feel it. And so I think through this reading of the context, in its context, lies an intersection between also the sensual and the political, as well as between forms of design and societal cultures. Artists do this intuitively sometimes, and architects, I think, because we have to be more grounded in terms of responding to many other forces, we don't. Through the lens of artists, they often see these disjunctures in their art. And as architects, we are aware of and concerned with many issues from societal through planetary scales, ranging from poverty and public health to urban violence and climate change. And I think this is where, if we keep letting our spheres of concern expand without finding ways through archive research, pedagogy, to calibrate our spheres of influence, I think we'll have no agency at all. And we'll articulate the problem better and better and be able to respond to it less and less. And I think that's partly the condition that I at least begin to read here. So I'm going to now look at investigations, which is now very specific research projects. And so I think the research and theory in a sense are linked. So this is my book, Kinetic City, and I've been calling Mumbai the kinetic city. And in my view, the framing of this phenomena under the rubric of informal, etc., is not productive. And so therefore, I was using the word kinetic. And I think this is an urbanism created by those often outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state. And it's what the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city simply to survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. Here, architecture, as I said, wasn't even the single spectacle of the city. And of course, it's not a design tool, but it is a way of being more empathetic to what happens in the city and being able to account for it. So, for example, I use the example of weddings. So the kinetic city is not just about the city of the poor, it's also the rich use it. We use it with the shamiyanas for our wedding on the maidans all the time, and the cricketers come back the next morning. That's a temporal moment. It's a sign of elasticity in the city. We do it surreptitiously, we do it under the radar. Cannot this be formalized within regulations to allow temporal occupation? It happens in the Ganesh festival. Streets get closed, pandals get made. This is not something architects pay attention to as part of the tools in terms of organizing and imagining the city. And so really this work was really about challenging the idea of the city as a static and stable entity. There are many examples in the book. I'm not going to go into it. There are examples of transaction, of spectacle, etc. Public space, conservation. I mean, the town hall gets wrapped on the 15th of August, right? It's an interesting moment because the PWD, that's the only way they can get the governor up those steps without getting them wet. We all freak out, grade 1 building, what are you doing? But the next morning the cloth goes and it doesn't damage the building, I think. And it's a way that the kinetic city has appropriated the static city and created a new meaning, albeit temporarily, right? So time, how do we embed time in our imagination of planning? Landscape architects do that automatically because they have to imagine plants growing and they see time as a way. Architects don't have a way, planners don't have a way. We haven't paid enough attention to time and how you can embed time. That is the temporal, the reversible, etc. So this became an interest, and that's where the research on the kinetic city really led to the Kumbh Mela. And that was called Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. I used to lecture to my students about the kinetic city, and I would always, my last slide would always be an image from the Kumbh Mela. And I would jokingly say that, if you're not convinced of what I'm saying, go to the Kumbh Mela. And then one day I got up and I said, I must go to the Kumbh Mela myself. And so we went to the Kumbh Mela. It was a very interesting project. In 2010, we started working on it. And the Kumbh Mela had been mapped. I mean, there's a lot of literature on the Kumbh Mela, but it's literature by scholars who are looking at gender studies, religious scholars looking at religion, and photographers. Raghuveer Singh was the first one who did that small square book on the Kumbh Mela, and that was the first documentation really as a photographer. And there have been 100 books after that, because, I mean, the Kumbh Mela, you point your camera anywhere, you're going to get a fantastic image, right? And so it's a spectacular moment. But no one had studied it as a city. And my research on the kinetic city made me want to study this and understand that mess as a city. And this was research. Now, all of these are lectures in themselves, and I'm just showing you and connecting the dot. So while I take a sip of water, these are just some images. Now the sound is that. Yeah, I mean, I can hear it, but I can't put it up for some reason. Anyway, it's fine. Just see, just some. Yeah, so you guys are all familiar with the Kumbh Mela, but really it was about trying to see it as a city, as a human settlement, albeit for 55 days, and what that meant. And you know, try to understand what we are seeing, because it's kind of bizarre. And so it was 6 months of work, it was 10 days of living there, making trips before that, to understand the construction. So we documented it through the process of construction, the making of the bridge, talking to we had all the administrators come and spend a week with us in Boston. We recorded them, we understood from them how it worked, what failed, and then that's how we kind of did the book. But I'll just sort of go. So it was actually a project that for the first time I learned what interdisciplinary work would be, and it was these various schools. And you know what was interesting and what I learned, we talk about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary very loosely sometimes. What was interesting here was that no discipline owned the knowledge on the project. So nobody from these schools, including the design school, had any idea of what they were going to understand. And when that happens, and I mean, I think for teachers, it's a great way to think of a problem, completely wicked problem out of the box. Once you do that, then there's collaboration, because everyone depends on each other's insights. Because no one, if the design school students had understood this, they would have been, you know, leading the charge. But no one understood it. So it became, I think, experienced for the first time what was true interdisciplinary work, where we were dependent on everyone's insights. And I think that for me was one of the most beautiful things about the project. And you know, this idea that on the Sangam, these two rivers, that's a monsoon image, and you come back in October and a whole city has emerged on the land bank. And of course the path of it changes every year. That's an image we took in October when the water was yet there, and from the same spot, this is the same tree, this was on Sankranti, and we took an image on Sankranti, and that same spot from October end, November, December, by the middle of January, a whole city had come up. And of course, everyone started calling it a pop-up city, and it's absolutely not a pop-up city, because what goes behind it is absolutely mind-boggling. It is like managing any of these cities. It has the equivalent of governance systems, infrastructure, and all of that. And these are the bridges that go across. It's a perfect grid. Every bridge goes across the river. So if the river, there's an unseasonal rain, or the dam bursts, so they have to increase the water in the dam to flush it, which is what they do for public health reasons. The city doesn't sort of get paralyzed in any way. So it's an incredibly efficient system. It's really a grid put on top of the sandbanks, and every time the river is different. And again, like I said, this is a lecture in itself in terms of how the akhadas are allocated space, what are the principles by which each of the akhadas actually they each self-organize themselves. And that's also a learning, that if you have a neutral infrastructure and a grid, then the smaller blocks can create an incredible amount of diversity because you have cohesion in terms of the overall infrastructure. And so there were many lessons, and like I said, I can do a whole hour or two on this, but a few things that for me were incredibly important. One was, this was one of the eureka moments. Everything above the ground in the Kumbh Mela is made out of these 5 materials. Everything. Bamboo, which is 8 feet tall, nails or screw, string or rope, a skinning material, it could be corrugated metal or a fabric. And everything that's made above the ground is just these 5 materials. So it's a kit of parts that gets assembled and disassembled incredibly quickly. This has evolved over thousands of years. There are tentwalas, there are people who are in the business. There's a whole ecology of material supply. And so the red line you see is 8-foot bamboo. It goes up to a temple as big as that can accommodate a few hundred people. And you see the scale, but it's all the same material. That was a real revelation which helped us understand how the city was built so quickly and dismantled so quickly. And it gets decorated, it's not recognizable. The fabric takes on different dimensions and creates a different identity. And then on the last day, on the last week, people leave, the mats are left, and then there's no memory of the city left. Now, like I said, there are many interesting aspects of this, which I can talk about. For one, governance was very important. And governance is also on a temporal scale, which is incredible. And we've got maps in the book that show how it shifts. So it shifts. It starts with the chief minister. Then in 3 months, it goes to all the bureaucrats. In 3 months, it goes to the Allahabad commissioner. And then for the 4 months before the festival, you have the Mela Adhikari. And the Mela Adhikari only reports to one person. So there's a suspension of hierarchy on a temporal scale. Now, if you think about it, climate change, the emergencies we have, we ought to think in these terms, because then you can respond quickly. Our cities can't respond quickly to crises because sometimes in cities the governance structure is older than even the buildings. And so with changing times, with the flux, governance would have to become much more nimble and work on a temporal scale in terms of how it can shift in terms of these hierarchies. So these are all the kinds of lessons that have been mapped in a way to bring these ideas where time is the embedded driver into the planning discourse, in a way to infect the planning discourse with the temporal dimension. That if one can see outside the box in these ways, it could be helpful. In any case, this became an interesting research project, and one of the good things about being at the university is you get criticism. And I was, I'm talking about not people shouting at me, but in a positive way, colleagues saying that, look, this is an amazing study, but it's a religious festival. What does it mean for anything else? Because in a religious festival, there's singular purpose, right? Everyone, they're all Hindus going there, right? The Buddhists come because we could argue Buddhism is a reform movement of Hinduism in some crazy way. And so, it's a single purpose and therefore it works efficiently. But what does it mean? How is it helpful? You're talking about challenging the planning discourse with the temporal dimension. So we took on that challenge. I ran a seminar class, I had students, we thought about it, and we came up with this rubric of ephemeral urbanism. We called it Cities in Constant Flux, and we documented over 300 cases in detail, and we constructed what I would call a taxonomy, and a taxonomy that looks at this broader idea of ephemeral urbanism beyond the Kumbh Mela. Using the Kumbh Mela, so the kinetic city, kinetic became ephemeral, city became urbanism, and then that became the Kumbh Mela, and then we created this taxonomy. So this is just giving you a sense of how people, about millions and millions of people on this planet live in these sorts of conditions. The Kumbh Mela is one. So these are all the researches, and then we made a taxonomy of the ephemeral landscapes of religion. So that was one, and there are hundreds of this. and we mapped all of these. Then there was of celebration, and we mapped these because these are also massive events. Woodstock was laissez-faire, but since then they've been Burning Man. I mean, they're just amazingly well organized and orchestrated. Of transaction, which is temporary markets. So what we usually deal with are markets, right? Vendors and things, but it's of transaction. So we mapped a number of them around the world on transaction. Of extraction, because mining towns also lose their resources. So I went to Chile, to the mining towns to study them. 50 years is the maximum copper lasts. The whole town has to be moved out after that because there is no copper left there. So these are also temporary. Of military, this is all from the internet. We won't have driven around in these military camps, but this is all the which lasts for 20, 30 years. Of refuge, which we call refugee camps, so of refuge. And there are hundreds, and Dabad and things have been around for, again, 25 years. Of natural disaster. And so therefore then how do we kind of make it a planning tool was the question. And so these are the taxonomies, and it goes from, ones which are of celebration where the parameters are quite different in the way these are organized: religion, celebration, transaction. Everyone's upbeat, right? Extraction is in the middle. Disaster, military, refuge, the issues become, the contestations become acute. Therefore, you have to look at them in completely different ways. As settlements, if one has to intervene and stuff. Now, even the UN and many global agencies have actually created absolute solutions for these. They have a prefabricated tent, they distribute it, and you put them in rows. You kill community, you kill ways people can self-organize. There are lots of problems. And so therefore we thought if it can be categorized like this, it could be infused into those discourses which are very active. And this became a book which is called Does Permanence Matter? And it became a big installation at the Venice Biennale with all these films, etc. Then the next criticism I got was, but what does this mean for architecture? So one extended it down to the unit of architecture, and this with Naman Ahuja, I did an issue for Marg magazine in October ago, which is on tents. It's called Cities on the Move. And here we looked at tents as that it's an emblem of it's probably the oldest emblem of human settlement, the tent, very fundamental. And so this is an issue of Marg that actually looks at tents as ephemeral and enduring. That's a tent of, a Mughal camped city, and many cities at Mughal times were based on the tent. The tent setter had the status of a governor who would go up ahead to set up the tent. The city and its organization was incredibly important. But also tents in a way that, we look at Mughal, we go to Fatehpur Sikri and see stone and chhajjas, and we see rings on the chhajjas, and the guide tells you that's where they put the torches for the flames to light it up. But those were actually meant for these shamiyanas, which were tied over courtyards to modulate the heat and the cool, and to trap cool air, to let out hot air, etc. So, to see Mughal architecture without the fabric, without the ephemeral, without the reversible, without the soft, is actually an incomplete reading. And any miniature painting tells you the full story, because the cloth becomes critical, and it is performative as well as aesthetic. And so therefore, how does one actually bring this into the discourse? The Bedouin tents are like high intelligence, in that the person who sets them up studies the wind, the sand, where it would accumulate, where the entrance should be. It's actually an art and a science to set up a Bedouin tent, which then of course inspired many tents around the world, the Hajj terminal. But Fry Otto, who did the Munich Olympics, is no different from the Bedouin tents in terms of the logic. And that's Fry Otto, the German engineer, and Shigeru Ban, the Japanese architect, recently. So it's also contemporary things we look. This is Markets in Bangladesh, which was finally the cover, which is also stunningly beautiful. This is a market that is built on a grid in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, which a student of mine studied for her thesis. We included her essay in it. And you just look at it. It's a whole market that comes up. So the ephemeral landscapes of transaction, these are massive. It involves hundreds of thousands of people, and it gets assembled and disassembled at a throw. And that in Bahrain, I think that image of a wedding tent, which is interesting. But the research questions that I think as a society, community throws up for us is with this notion of uncertain, uncertainty, how do we nuance uncertainty on a temporal scale? How do we talk about the life cycle of materials? We've forgotten to do that. In conservation, it comes up by default. If you think about it, in conservation, the conservation of any building, all the problems reside where two materials of two different life cycles meet each other. So a wooden rafter on a stone wall, it gives way there because the wood has a less life cycle than the stone, and then we put a stainless steel jacket to give it a longer life. But we don't look at this when we design our buildings. That is, how do we have life cycles? So this is, again, I mean time in this way, because by embedding time in our imaginaries to ask these questions, it opens up conversations in conservation and the design of new buildings, etc. So how do we embed it, temporality, in our disciplinary thinking? How do we theorize permanence in the temporality of the home? This is something I haven't yet been able to articulate, but in the home it all breaks down as an argument because the impulse is permanence by nature, right? Whether it's the poorest person or the wealthiest, and that's why we have the redevelopment, the SRA. I mean, I think one of the biggest drivers of that is the fact that someone has a home as an asset, right? There's a sense of permanence, however poor the quality might be. So how does one articulate these conversations within that? And the idea of permanent temporariness, which is, I think, a state that we will be in. And then the last piece of research, which is my new research, the book is going to be out soon, I hope, is what is urban? So now one is zooming out, the context of the context. We look at all these things, but how do you zoom out to see what is the context? So what is urban? And again, propositional research, the night lights become a proxy to begin to start talking about what those might be. And so what we did was we got the last census. Luckily this new census hasn't come out, otherwise this book would have been out of time. So I hope the census takes a little longer so I can finish this. But using the night lights as a proxy, we began to question, what is urban India really? And these are the three criteria for governments in India to define what a city is: that a population of over, or a town is, or what is urban, population of over 5,000, a density of 400 people per square kilometer. I mentioned Houston. Greater Houston is a density of 240 people per square kilometer. So 400 is already a pretty high density. Over 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. And this has a history of rural funding, and there are many reasons why it's only male, but it hasn't yet been changed. So if more than 75% of the male are doing other things but agriculture, it doesn't qualify. So you have to meet these three criteria. So what's interesting is that we, as a result of this is urban India in our imagination, big circles and small circles distributed all the way. But this is completely different from what you see in the night lights, right? You see a much more robust, contiguous disposition of urban areas just reading the night lights. And that's very interesting because we broke it down. So we said the first criteria, 5,000 people. If we took only one criteria of 5,000 people per settlement, per square kilometer, or minimum population of 5,000 people, that's what urban India looks like. If you took the minimum population density of 400 people per square kilometer, that's what urban India looks like. They are dramatically different in a reading. So what is the criteria you use? Because the densities tells you where people are living, right? The 5,000 just tells you a distribution. Now our infrastructure decisions are being made on this criteria, where airports are situated, where highways go, etc. This is a completely different reading. So in this reading of 400 people per square kilometer, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, 300 million people, it's the world's biggest megacity that goes from Kashmir, as you can see, all the way to Bangladesh, and it's the width of the Gangetic Plain. It's mind-boggling. It's the world's biggest. It's continuous density for people who have, driven there and been there. And then the other place you have a consistency is Kerala, clearly for the reasons we know, because of disaggregated growth through Kerala. Now, if I took the criteria of 75% of the male population working in non-agriculture, the megacity disappears completely because everyone in the Indo-Gangetic Plain comes as a taxi driver here, has a factory, does something else, right? So it's a flux. How do you understand this flux for planning? And what is the criteria that you use? So these are diametrically opposite readings in a sense. So our research is showing, one is the pandemic-induced reverse migration it all went to that place where the highest density occurs, where 300 million people do other things but agriculture. And you can see it in the geography of our country, right? Our research is showing that actually something even more interesting, which is this number will go up to about 15,000 now, which we are calling transitioning settlements. These are settlements that have all the attributes of being urban, but they are yet defined as villages. And some of these transitioning settlements are over 100,000 people, 200,000 people, but they are yet run by a panchayat because they don't meet the 3 criteria. And that is the urban time bomb that India is sitting on. That we haven't, so sanitation, so they don't have municipalities, they don't have funds or grants for sanitation, so they are actually being run as villages. So within the rural, and that's partly why the 75% has been an attribute, that they get funding, and sometimes the funding for rural development is bigger, and so they choose not to meet the criteria because they get funding. So it's also a political question. But if you look at it objectively, that is the time bomb we are sitting on, where we have 15,000 settlements, which I think are, it will be about 200-300 million people. I don't know what the new numbers will be, that actually are in places classified as villages and don't have the attributes in terms of infrastructure. So this is, again, zooming out completely. And so from this, I'll just finish advocacy and pedagogy, and we'll take a break. I think Jaya is exhausted, so no, you're not exhausted. Yeah, okay. So I'll just finish this because this is... So therefore, I think for me, the research extends from this in understanding the context. These are books on Mumbai. I don't call these books that are... for me, these are instruments of advocacy, because I think that's one way of embedding research in the ground. I call them instruments of advocacy because some of them cover history, most of them are co-authored that you see here. Most with Sharda, this with Firoza Godrej and Pauline Rohatgi, that with Abha Narayan. But these were about when VT was becoming a World Heritage Site, we thought, Sharda and I thought it was important. We went to the archives, we got all the original drawings, so they are all scanned and put in there, so you see actually Stephen's drawings, etc. And many of you know these books. But for me, these are instruments of advocacy. And then with many others, and Sham Chainani, BAG, Cyrus Gazdar, who's here, these became instruments that we could then work collectively, that is a group of us as architects, but also activists who are advocates, to convert this into regulation. And I think for me, this is a message to my colleagues, my profession, which is we often do research and sit on it because we just love that research and we can't let go to make it become anything useful. I think you have to have the generosity for the research to go out, and therefore if one looks at them as instruments of advocacy, then you partner with advocates to make usefulness out of that. Because often architects are good researchers, but they might not be good advocates. And I think this has been a huge problem. I see it in our profession around the country, that a lot of research doesn't find its way because it doesn't have the venues. But if these are looked at as instruments of advocacy, they have much more traction. And then I think the fourth area being declared, and then us going back and asking the question, what is a contemporary, this is a UDRI, what is a contemporary engine that might drive it, allowed us to think about the notion of significance as not being, again, static, talking about time. And so how do we actually take significance and begin to create a new significance? So the Kala Ghoda area, the Kala Ghoda never existed as a cultural or an art district. That is the significance we invented. But when you do that, then the burden on you as an architect and an activist is even greater. That is, how do you keep the illusion of architecture intact while yet bringing new associative values and significance to it, which becomes really very, very important. And I think at present there's far too much premium being paid to innovation over repair. I think we need to change that rubric. And maintenance. I think what we need in the city more than anything is maintenance, not innovation. And repair treats every artifact as a politically neutral armature of resources and as an artifact that possesses embodied energy. So I think by changing and expanding our narratives about conservation beyond the nostalgic to also questions of embodied energy, sustainability within the problems of the world today, I think will give us all much more traction. So perhaps necessity is the mother of repair, not the mother of invention, at least in Mumbai today. And I think learning from repair too, we can address questions of life cycles of material. Repairing, and pairing is bringing new material as a new pairing in a sense, which might be new ways to see it. So heritage is not a fixed object, would either be preserved or discarded, but a space where different temporal claims meet and interact. In this model, architecture becomes the site of negotiation where the present, past, and future coexist and continuously shape each other. That heritage is then understood as a dynamic encounter, one that is about really a dialogue. And that's what we were trying to do at the Kala Ghoda area, to invent this use as a way to drive the conservation process. That was Hussein's image of the Kala Ghoda, which was in the first festival. He drew it in place there before Zakir Hussain performed. That was sold, and that money went into the corpus. Things like the parking lot repair in those days, this is now going back into the 90s, was done, and the place animated. So all of this came from the funds collected from the festival and the goodwill of the festival in those days. I must say, to me, the festival is now too big for that space. There's a mismatch between the festival and the space, and that must be sort of recalibrated. And also then contemporary interventions, things that were being done in the Prince of Wales Museum. At that point, we began to also get involved in repairing, recycling, industrial spaces into galleries. This was a Bodhi Art Gallery in the Eastern Portlands near Bhaucha Dhaka. It was a simple shed, and Bodhi asked us to do something with it. We made it an installation space. It no longer, of course, exists. Or some of you might know Mascara Gallery. That was a car repair store. When Abhay approached us, we said we must repair it. But also how you make new interventions. This is the Lalbhai Museum in Ahmedabad. How do you make new interventions to speak to historic buildings? This is the Chaumala Palace, which was again about creating new significance, making it a museum on the Nizam's legacy, but also bringing all the attributes of conservation. And we were also asked to do the site management plan for the Taj. And we decided to kind of take a much broader view than the one-liner the Taj has become, and look at different perspectives of the Taj and how it was imagined. And one of that was looking at it from the river, which is how it was intended to be approached. It was experienced by all the nobility at that time through the river. These were river monuments, and Agra was the greatest, must have been the greatest riverfront in those days with all these monuments. The water here was not more than a foot deep. We had a flat canoe on which we had to photograph these things. And then that resulted in books, this one with Amita, which is more a story of the Taj. But that is a studio book which I did with my students over 6 months, where we came and really mapped the river and made an argument for how you could revive the economy of Agra by reviving the monuments along the river and actually repairing the river. Because that's actually even how Shah Jahan approached the Taj. He never went through the garden. That was for his visitors. And so conservation, I think, as a rubric, needs to be much more nuanced. I think once you embed time and a temporal dimension in it, it opens up many, many other possibilities. This is a wonderful diagram. These are my last 2-3 slides in this section, where Irem Koolhaas did this, where he said, when the 1882 Act was instituted for conservation, the artifacts they were looking at were 200 BC. That was the impulse to preserve them. In 1900, when they made the revision, what was included in it were artifacts from 1712. So you see the gap between the moment of the regulation and the object that is being conserved is absolutely shrinking. By the 1960 revision, we started listing 20th century buildings. So the gap is almost closed. So what happens when the gap actually closes? What does that mean? And my projection is that in the future, this might also save our city. In the future, when you go for building sanctions, there will be a box that will have to be ticked, which the Heritage Committee will be empowered to do, that whether should this building be preserved in the future. So it will become, you will decide before a building is built whether you're going to preserve it in the future. So therefore then the architect can use materials to last for 500 years or materials to last for 50 years, right? I mean, that's the only way you can logically interpret this, right? And so therefore, what projective preservation is really planning. And I think one of the problems with preservation and the discourse around it is it's jumped the basket of planning. It is merely an instrument of planning that helps any society modulate the rate of change. Under Mao, the Cultural Revolution, China was prepared to take massive change. They're slowing down now, right? The British haven't yet reconciled the fact that the sun is set on the empire, so they're keeping everything intact because they're yet figuring out how they have to deal with that change, right? In India, we think of conservation in the past in much different ways. Itihas, Stephen Hawking, etc., which is not to say we should be destroying buildings, but within these sort of very clear contextual situations, we have to reinvent the narratives by which we actually talk about projective preservation, which is really planning. That is, essentially, it's an instrument of planning, conservation, that helps a society modulate the rate of change that it can deal with as a society. And I think that is the most fundamental aspect of conservation. And then that we've extended into books and on architecture, because contemporary architecture is as important. This is a book I did in 2010, where I got interested in the idea of models of practice, which is that, you know, the global practices are practices which express impatient capital, but drawings are emailed from somewhere in the world and a building is built. They have nothing to do with the site. These are tyranny of images, etc. Regional manifestations are local assertions that are talented architects. I mean, I would say Doshi, Charles Correa, Raj Rewal, that generation, were people who took the fluxes from around the world, modernity, and tried to make it local. Alternate practices were people like Laurie Baker. That's a model of practice where instructions are communicated in completely different ways in each one of these practices. And counter-modernism is the akshardhams and things where things are communicated in a completely different way, which is not to say they're not modern, they're not cutting edge, they are, but it's a completely different model of practice and it gives you different images. And what's interesting in these models of practice is the global practice and counter-modernism, which is the akshardhams, the vipassana, about shiny surfaces. They're about purity. They're about not being corrupted, whether it's financial purity or religious purity. The regional manifestation are earthy, they're grounded, they're of the soil, they're brown, they're red, they have a kind of very tactile feeling. And so there are many things you can read by then looking at models of practices as a lens, because instruction, who you're giving the instruction for, and what is that local knowledge you are relating to or not relating to, becomes a way that you can read it. And of course, these were made into exhibitions. Again, I'm looking at this or sharing with you this as ways I see these as as instruments of advocacy. The exhibitions also become an instrument of advocacy, and each one of these talk about different things. This one is then sanitation, because we began to look at sanitation when we look at urban India, and I realized that there were 300 million people who are living in places that are villages and don't have sanitation. What does it mean for sanitation? So we looked for a couple of years, we very deeply looked at sanitation, public toilets, government toilets. We also developed prototypes for Spark, for public toilets, where we could create different ways of creating community space and embedding them within communities. We did competitions that looked at how you could embed a public toilet with other services so that it doesn't become there's no stigma attached to it in the way it is, and how you look at it as a much broader ecology of sanitation. So we call them sanitation hubs. I mean, during the pandemic, these are places you can test, and you can have a pathology lab there, and you can take a read on the community's health by just checking urine every morning or taking random blood samples for malaria and other things. And so this has been developed now into a whole catalog with tender docs and for different locations, different situations, how you can look at materials, from that come up with certain forms, and beginning to say how they can become markets as well as toilets, and how different things can happen. And this is a book we've done which is like a handbook for anyone. Any NGO can use it to actually see what it might cost, etc. These then I capture usually as studios. So I did a whole studio for 6 months on this with my students. The series is called Extreme Urbanism, where from an extreme condition you can actually cull research that opens up many other kind of questions for you, all wicked problems. So this is a series of books which capture that. And again, these are instruments of advocacy. They are given to UDRI and other NGOs for whom some of it might be very helpful to formulate a proposal. So I'll now go to the last part, and here I'm going to show you 6 or 7 projects, from some houses to a recent museum we've done to other institutional buildings in Ahmedabad. So it's going to be 6 architectural projects. Okay, so this will be the last part. I'll show projects, so it's always nice to see images. Like I said, I mean, I'm not going to kind of relate things that we've talked about as observations, investigations, particularly to the projects, but I hope some of it will be implicit, at least in the way we've picked up some of these problems. Okay. So this is now, we come to practice, which is this section. And I said, as I was trying to describe, context matters. How we discern context is very critical. And I think instruments of advocacy are totally linked for me to practice. And in the propositions, the way I've sort of broken it down is the home and house, dwelling, which is how you aggregate homes, one project on each of these. Then livelihoods, which are workspaces, how could we do these differently? And then amenities, which are institutions. So actually dwelling, livelihoods, amenities, and then mobility are the DNA of any city. But as an architect, of course, with mobility, that's infrastructure, which is often outside our purview. But how we do dwellings, how we make places for livelihoods, and how we situate amenities, I think is very important. So as all architects that we started off by doing weekend homes and things, and in the metropolitan area of Mumbai it was important. Some of the principles I was sharing with you about the inward, the courtyard house, the autonomy of architecture. That's not a project we did. I remember, I'll never forget the first time I got my first sort of weekend house to do in Alibag, which is when you make the big transition from interiors to architecture. I was on the boat with a contractor, and I remember I asked him, what are you doing? I happened to know him, so he says, and I don't want to use the name, but he said, I'm designing a house for a very important pop star. So I said, wow. So I said, who's the architect? That was my first question. I was jealous that it was an architect doing this. Who was the architect? He said, no, I'm the architect. So I said, but how are you designing it? So no, he said, she just gave me a picture of the White House and asked me to build it, so I'm building it. So that's the house that came up there. And it's a house with barbed wire on a big fence. It has beware of dog signs. It really, actually, he took me there, it was yet under construction before I was going to my site. And it was very disturbing. It made me really think that actually we were talking about binaries and these polarities, urban, rural, rich, poor. Architecture is a very critical instrument that can harden a threshold or soften a threshold. And it actually polarizes society. If you think about it, architecture more than anything, whether it's the image, whether it's actually the form, whether it's notions of access, it's what really divides societies and accelerates that condition. And it made me just think of how one could do this differently. We were lucky with a client who was very open, and that is a house we did for him. He was a young filmmaker at that time, and that is the living room of the house. Talking to him, we said, how often are you going to go here? We discovered he was being optimistic. He said, I'll spend 30 days in a year here, this holiday, that holiday. So I thought, what would you do for this house? Even if you spend 65 days in the year, for 300 days, what happens to this house? And so we designed it in a way that it could be appropriated by the caretaker. So the veranda, those Mora chairs go in, there's a tap in the corner. This is what they use as their living room. They spend all their time. That time it was a teakwood kind of grove. Now houses have come up all around it. And they always sat there. And when they close the house, put the furniture away, the caretaker, who is from the village, actually uses it. He hangs out here. There's been a wedding here. He meets his friends here in the evening. So it becomes a way that you soften the threshold of that house versus you harden it by exclusion. And it does nothing to them because it's a very basic house. But of course, it's not that you make it sloppily. We articulated it well. That's the veranda. The roof's all sloped. They collect water. That slab is a big gutter. It feeds the well. So the well is always charged. It has a water tank. So those 2 taps are open to anyone from the village when they are not there, and they're very generous about it, and it allows this form of transgression, which is what I call softening thresholds. How can we do that? I mean, now we won't open it to the public, but even if you had the caretaker who from the village brought friends there, it already becomes a form of making it more gentle in terms of that polarity. So this was one of the early houses, and then we were asked more recently, 10 years, 12 years ago, by a well-known doctor to design his house in Alibag, and he bought this land, and he wanted almost close to the White House, and wanted a high building looking at this. And so for us, actually, each of these really become research projects. That's why I see that blur in some ways. So the question I asked myself for this project was that there's a village that's growing. Soon this whole house is going to be engulfed by the village around it. That 1 acre they have will be the buffer, but that's not enough. So that became an important question. I also then personally thought it should be my research project. Every client has an agenda on a building, so I think architects should also have an agenda in terms of their research project. At that point, I was very interested in incremental housing, and I said, how could one design a weekend house which could be designed for a middle class person who could build 1 unit of it, and as his wealth grew or her wealth grew, they would add to it. So how do we actually use this also as a way to make a beautiful weekend home for a whole family that has the wealth, but also that it's a principle that we can extract and theorize about, which we could use to inform other projects. So therefore it becomes an agenda we bring to it in a sense. And so essentially it became a series of, so the top thing there is a living room, dining room and kitchen. There's a lap pool here, there's a study for the doctor there, there's a guest room, and this wing at the bottom are 3 bedrooms where the family, the 2 kids and the parents can live. If they have guests, they have blinds that they can close, otherwise it becomes a big room. And so it sits in the landscape in this way. The scale is the local basalt stone, and you have these sloping roofs that sort of move inwards. There's a hint of a copper edging, so for someone with a sophisticated eye, by seeing the copper, they realize that it is urban. Some of the windows near the entrance are finished in copper. That is the only material. When you come into the house, it's a series of courtyards. The pool itself frames nature, but it's discrete, because again, this was something I felt in terms of binaries and things. We build these pools, and it's hedonism, and then you have gardeners who are from the local village working simultaneously. Everyone feels awkward in that relationship. So by making the pool inward, discrete, you yet get glimpses of the green. It allows it to be enjoyed at night as a water body, but it also becomes more private and discrete within a landscape where these disparities exist automatically. And so therefore, how does one, through material, through disposition of scale, through programmatically articulating places that otherwise create forms of ostentation, I think is very important. I mean, one of the problems in our society today is that ostentation has become very much in your face. I think, at least for me, growing up in the 50s and 60s, ostentation was discreet. It was in weddings. People were ostentatious about where their kids were studying and how they got them abroad. Now ostentation is in your face. And also in the process, what has happened is the things that had to be more public have become very private, like space, like open space, like amenities have become very private, which should be public, and things that were to be very private, like weddings and all, have become public, right? And so there's a whole reversal in our society, and it plays out in these sorts of projects where we build homes and you create polarization by default, just because of the way the architecture and just where a swimming pool is put, etc. So I think for us the concern has been to let these broader readings of the state of society in some ways also inform the decisions that we make. And so that's how the house sits with the landscape of the fields from the village. It'll stand out a bit, but it otherwise is incredibly discreet. This is the bedroom wing, which has sliding screens. It's very Japanese in its disposition. The blinds come down. So if the kids are there, it's one big space. If they have guests, the blinds come down. Water is collected and celebrated through the channel. And so there are moments and decisions made like that, which then becomes our way really to read the context. How do you aggregate this? This is a very interesting project. It was a competition we won for a housing project in Jaipur, to house 100 elephants and mahouts. It's called Hathi Gaon. It's in disrepair, unfortunately, right now, but with different governments it might change. But it was a very interesting project where we won a competition. That land on the top was completely barren, and you have very little rainfall in Jaipur. We made it a landscape project. So what we did was with a landscape consultant, Mohan Rao, we worked out how we could create an armature for nature, and in the interstitial spaces we would place the architecture. I mean, even in our cities, when we plan new towns, we design buildings, and in the interstitial space we put green, right? We said, what if you reverse the project? What is the logic of the water flowing? Where could you hold it? That will then tell you where you can build, rather than the other way around, where nature becomes subservient within the articulation of the larger disposition of the site plan. So those are our clients, the Mahout. They're generally Muslim. They earn 5,000-6,000 rupees a month, a little more with tips. They're really poorly paid. They look after those elephants. You see, the elephant itself doesn't look very healthy. The ears, the discoloring because of the paint. Of course, that's a picture from New York Times. That's what popularized, coming and riding and feeling like a Maharaja for a day. This is where the elephants lived before they moved here, which was like a garage with the Mahouts living on top. But the Mahouts couldn't control the elephants, so they would come and sleep with them down there, as you can see, because they have to they sing to these animals, they pet them, they have to create a bonding with them. And therefore, space was incredibly important, we realized, in doing that. That's what they do. They go to Amber a fort, you must have seen them. They take tourists up and down. They get painted in those toxic colors which discolors their skin. They don't have water. They've gone rogue. It doesn't get reported. They've killed tourists. It goes up to 50 degrees centigrade in the summer there. They yet go up these ramparts. It's almost, it's a terrible situation. And that was the site that we got, which had all been dug out by sand contractors in Jaipur. But that we used to our advantage to create the water. So we made water the central protagonist in the project. And we said, let's make the decisions based on water, series of micro dams. How would you regenerate the landscape? And that became then the plan. Some of it got built. Now they've overbuilt by filling it in here. It gets disrepaired and stuff. Vasundhara Raje was the prime minister who initiated this process, and she was committed to it, and she appointed us when we won the competition, and then she fell out of power. So it was a horrendous ride till she came back to power, and in that little window we finished it. And then she went out of power, and again they have just abandoned it because, one chief minister's project and the other chief minister's project. But what we did there was, I think, repaired the landscape, and it doesn't matter what happens to the architecture, at least nature is present. So this is what happened. That's the site as we got it in 2007. We dug up a little area to collect the water, and then she went out of power. For 3 years the project was abandoned. So in the 3 years it was abandoned, the nature generated itself. So whenever the chief minister, I took them to the site and I said, this could be amazing. And they revived it somewhat. And now in 2017, I took that picture. That's the same hill in all the three images. It's got like 10,000 trees now that have grown. There are birds there. There are people who come there for bird watching, not to see the elephants, because it's changed the ecology of the place. And people have started living there. The dish antennas have appeared. So that's a sign of life. So here, in a sense, which was very difficult for us, we didn't privilege the architecture. I had a moment there where I went to site, and we had done beautiful gargoyle details using sandstone to throw the water which would be collected. We thought we should celebrate water. And I went there, and there was a nice strapping PWD engineer, and I went to site, and they put PVC pipes everywhere. And I said, look, didn't you see the drawings? And these were his words. I'll never forget them. And actually it committed us to the project more, because we were going to abandon it because it was going haywire. He said, in niche logon ke liye aap ye kyun kar rahe hain? So for him to see a house for 200 square feet for the person with gargoyles and water being collected and beautiful details was unbelievable. And it was a kind of perverse attitude. And then one realized that that these are very difficult conditions of hierarchies and asymmetries which play out spatially just because of caste and hierarchy. And I at that time read something that Pratap Bhanu Mehta had written, which was very moving, and it really committed us. We were actually about to resign from the project, but we got so committed to it that we finished it to the end. And this is what Pratap Bhanu Mehta said in a special issue of Caravan that he did on equity. He said, in a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimum basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes. Why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hand rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of a social hierarchy might be really like. The very thing you would expect to instigate the questions of justice makes it even hard to raise them. And so, it's an interesting asymmetry that plays out spatially in many of these conditions, and we experienced it firsthand. Anyway, what we did for the project, of course, we spent a lot of time on the architecture. The government gave us 250 square feet, almost SRA, a little less than that. So what we did was, instead of having row houses, we made clusters and we made courtyards. So by extension, if the three families on the three houses got on well with each other, they had a private garden. So their house became really like a mansion. And so it was a way of subverting the limitation that the government had put in the bylaws of the design. We used the roof, which was keeping the hay for the elephants to keep it cool. We did things like that, which were basic climate principles, to take that low cost and turn it into something that would be very good. And this was the first phase that got built. You can see one of the water bodies. You see Amber Palace at the back. It was very inexpensively constructed. We created common spaces, etc. And we had to separate the children. So the elephants, we made these windows. The elephants could watch the kids of the Mahout, and the kids could stroke the trunk. It's very interesting. One of the things I learned here at site, we had to do mock-ups. And I learned that elephants can't sleep on flat land. They have to have a slight berm, because they turn around and they lie. If they go on a flat land, they can't get up. So you have to have a certain angle for that. So we had to test the size of the room. So our mock-ups were making elephants jump around so that we could see how they fitted and whether the room had to be big. And then we had to convince the government we needed 2 more feet square footage because they can't sit down. So the metrics were completely different, because we were dealing with another species, which for me was really moving and very, very interesting. And the Mahouts were very well organized. They had a president. They were organized as a social group. We got on very well with them, partly because they made fantastic biryani, but that gave us a kind of rapport with them, which became very important, and I'll talk about that in a way. And you can see the slope on the thing. This is a Mahout now coming home to his family. That's how, when we first built it, it was like that. That's the green that has taken over. These courtyards have become a luxury. And so in a funny way, by default, you have an inequality that gets corrected. So the middle class in Jaipur have to buy water because there's a shortage of water, so they buy tankers of water. But here the poorest in that community actually have more water. They grow flowers, they sell bougainvilleas, they actually have nurseries because they have the water that's accessible, because it's clear. And life corrodes architecture. The goats have moved in, the elephants and the goats coexist. The kitchen now has become the courtyard, so they get 1 extra room to have 1 more child stay. So they've made these transformations as they've gone along, and it will keep sort of changing. And the ones that get along well live like that. These houses, here's this guy's looking for his dinner, but the houses haven't been plastered here because they hadn't yet officially given it to them. Now they started officially giving it to them. It's all political. And then they will, of course, paint it, which is what we're looking forward to. One of the other things we learned was that elephants are social beings. So the Mahouts came to us and said, we don't have a budget, but we have to have them hang out with their buddies, because if they're alone, we can't control them. They get very claustrophobic. So whatever pipes were left and whatever steel was left, we just made a very inexpensive pavilion like this, where the elephants would meet once a day and hang out with each other, and they would have different ones come and socialize and stuff. But what was interesting was nothing we planned for. But the young mahouts saw that as an opportunity, and they started a company called Elephantastic. I think it's on TripAdvisor. And then they started charging 100 rupees if you want to take a selfie and feed the elephant, and 500 rupees if you want to have a bath with the elephant. So a whole economy developed for the young people. So it made me reflect on it, and it was nothing honestly that we planned, but it's really, if you create the armature for life, and I think that's where architecture has to really begin to become cognizant. And I think thinking about the research, writing about it, creating these feedback loops will only inform us as a community to think of these sorts of unintended experiences, conditions earlier. So it was really about creating infrastructure. That's a rendering, but it was really, that was the aspiration, to create a sense of dampness there, that in this hot desert climate, elephants that are tropical beings would have a habitat they could live in. And that is an image during the pandemic that one of the mahouts kids sent me, and that's what's happened now in that area. The water bodies are full, at least in the monsoon, and later the trees have grown. We have a lot of kikar so that the elephants can't just eat it, and it would deforest the place, etc. And that's one of the other things I learned in this, again by default, is the bonding between the mahouts and the elephant has become fantastic, because now they have a water body they bathe them in, and that soothing effect makes the elephants much gentler. So they bathe the elephants, and that itself is a process by which they play, they keep themselves wet. Their health is better. You see, because of the paint, and this is in summer when the water is the lowest. In the back, you see a little guest house we made for tourists to go and be very discreet. And they play around with each other, they bathe, but you see they're looking healthier than the first couple of pictures that you saw. This process of rubbing them and cleaning them is actually a process of bonding, which was very important. Again, we didn't realize it would happen. We just, I think, made the right decisions in terms of what was right for the site. So this is the little guest house we made. When we talked to Vasundhara Raja, had just come back, and I said to her that, look, it'll be good if you could have a place where serious tourists, scholars go. It's low-key, it's just khatiyas, rooms around a courtyard, and it's very discreet that they can watch life in Hathigao and write about it. And she asked us to go ahead. We built it all from the local material. Those are slabs of sandstone, so there's no concrete in that sense. It's just sandstone, random sandstone and large slabs of sandstone. And she would go herself and live here, actually stay here overnight, and it gave a lot of traction to the project, etc. After she lost the election, it's completely abandoned and they haven't used it. It was set up that the mahouts' wives would run it. They would cook. The furniture was made by the local community. It had all the intentions, but again, it just didn't align with the changing politics. So when they started getting allocated the houses, I thought I'd go and see Shekhawati paintings of elephants and things. And the first time I went there, I only saw paintings of birds. And they said now, because of the water and the trees, the bird watchers are all here. There's no one interested in the elephants. And so the mahouts were painting birds on there. Again, totally unintended, but wonderful. And many trees have been planted, and it's very green. Some parts of the site are really deep, because these are the lowest parts where water collects automatically, and so it's not evenly dense like this, but it was, as you saw in the first image, there was not a tree on that site. So it's a transformation. We learned a few things from this, and this is a mapping I did about governments. Those are the different governments. You see National Congress, it lasts for a while, but they react because the BJP had done it. Then the BJP comes back, Vasundhara Raja is back. I get a call from her, let's finish the project. We finish the project, then she loses the election. The number of agencies that change, we started with the tourism department, then the Umber development department, then it became the PWD, then it became the forest department, then it became an elephant welfare society, became the wild. Our clients kept changing. It was really interesting. And that was my last letter that she wrote to me to say, let's complete the project. But those are all the letters I wrote for 15 years to keep telling the bureaucrats do something. So we have a whole archive of those letters that we sort of did. What I learned very much from this was that, and this became a very useful lesson, is that architects look at clients as a unnuanced entity. I say you're my client. But I would argue that every project has many clients embedded in the notion of client, right? So I say there's a patron client, there's an operational client, and there's a user client. In this project, it became very vivid. Because we loved the biryani of the Mahuts and we got to meet them, we became the bridge. We became the bridge between the patrons, the operational, and the user. So actually, I realized that the Public Works Department, which is the operational client, would not even talk to the users because niche log the, right? The operational clients could not get, the PWD couldn't get an appointment with Vasundhara Raja. They had to go to the minister for civil, whatever. But we could do all of these things. We could talk to the Mahuts, we could handle the PWD and put them in their place if they were trying to fool around with specs. We could try to write to the chief minister and get an appointment, so we became the bridge. By nuancing the client in our mind, we began to make these bridges, getting everyone on the same side of the table, and that was very useful. In a single family house, the client, except for the fact that it's a couple that might have different opinions about the size of the wardrobe and things like that, it's the time when the client, the patron, the operational, the user becomes one entity. That's why we all love doing houses. We can do it much more easily than doing institutional buildings because the client gets collapsed into one entity. Therefore, their aspirations become much clearer. But when you have the Hatigaon, the patron's aspirations are something else, the operational client's aspirations are something else, and the user client's aspirations are completely different. In institutional buildings, which is why it became much easier for us to deal with institutional buildings, it's like if I'm doing a project in a campus, the president of the university is the patron client, and then the campus engineer is the operational client, and the students and faculty are the user clients. We tend as architects to align with one of the three. Either we become the president's architect and then we are running roughshod over everyone else, or we become radicalized and say the faculty and users want this and no one else up there listens to us, right? So how do you align these nuanced readings of the client is a very important thing, and for me, this project became a learning to go forward on many of these other projects. And so this is our first project. We did this and designed this in 1994 when the office was 4 years old. We were doing houses and interiors, but this client made us sign a disclosure, understanding that we would never publish it. So we never published it. So we did this big building and we went back to doing small houses. It's a corporate office for LMW, Lakshmi Machine Works in Coimbatore. That was a client brief to us. He said, this is 94, we had just liberalized our economy in 1992. He said, I've got an Australian curtain glazing vendor. I've signed a thing with them. They're going to bring in the glass. We want a 12 floor office building, garden in the front of the fountain, the parking at the back. That was a simple brief. We were so shocked. I was 34 years old, didn't have the confidence. I said, what about just making it lie on its face, and then we can get courtyards and we can do a more traditional building. But they turned out to be wonderful clients. They were young, but they were also very deeply rooted in tradition. And so this idea that we, at the time of liberalization, I was talking to you about these simultaneous transitions, if we actually reinforce the way we might connect to our traditions to invent a paradigm for a workspace, it would be probably a much more powerful statement even to your partners who come in from Switzerland. And they agreed. And we went ahead and did this building, which was a 20,000 square foot Mangalore tile roof with a series of water bodies that cool the building passively because this is in the rain shadow. It's a series of 3 courtyards. The courtyards become smaller in size, which indicates a privacy gradient. So it's designed like a house for the owners. By the time you get to the last courtyard, it feels like their large home. And so these are water bodies, they're courtyards, this kind of green. It's all single loaded corridors, so it all ventilates naturally. Now, of course, they have air conditioning as the city has grown around them, but it was designed to completely ventilate naturally and get cooled and humidified by the water body. And as you go up to the private areas, it becomes much more intimate. They also gave us a budget for art, and we didn't want to put paintings on the wall, so Rajiv Sethi helped us put together a group of artists that worked on the building elements. That means the railing, the staircases, the jalis, etc. So it became a collaborative project with artists. And so that's Manjeet Bawa with Rajiv Sethi doing sketches. He did all the railings. These are his figures which he embossed in copper, and they became the railing on the cables. That's Rajiv Sethi. He did a flag with 108 Lakshmis, which is the name of their building. And that Sharad Shah was the engineer trying to figure out how to suspend this flag, which was going to weigh quite a lot. So there were many artists. this, we took all the edges of the granite when they were dressed, the edges of the granite, and we piled them up to create the ripples for the waterfalls. So these were all artists doing the lotus, and Lakshmi was made as a statue at the back, floating on the lotus. That's a Mughal jali, and so we wanted to do jalis because it was based on cross ventilation. So this is Yogesh Rahul, the late Yogesh Rahul, really miss him. He went to the factory, the machine tool factory, and he picked up all the scrap metal and he made jalis from the scrap metal and a whole lot of designs. That's the scrap metal, and it's a wonderful gesture because the material that has given this office wealth, the employees touch it on a daily basis because they're reminded of all the pressings that come for the different machines they're booking and placing orders for. So for them, there's a literacy to understand which machine was made from many of these sort of pressings. And so you see it becomes tighter in front of the toilets for privacy. It's about 24 or 26 different patterns that Yogesh Rahul put together, including that which I was shocked to see sold for scrap a few years ago because the Vastu consultant told them it's very bad Vastu to touch the compound wall. So they sold that for scrap. I wish they had even told us. We could have done something with it, but that's Yogesh Rahul's work that no longer sort of exists. So talking about workspaces, that made us think that we could do workspaces differently. And this is Hyderabad and Cyberabad. We were asked by an infrastructure company to build an office building for them. And for them, they wanted a glass block. Basically, they wanted a modern building. And we started noticing these fishing nets on all the buildings in Hyderabad when the Telangana thing was going, because glass buildings were perfect for rioters to stone. And so when the glass vendors sold you the glass, they gave you options of what color fishing net you wanted to add. They worked the details out of how it would be attached and everything. And I found that really shocking, and I said, this is the kind of this architecture of impatient capital, and what it signifies is just ruining our landscape. It's just bizarre what you see in adjacency. So we were instead inspired by this little hut while we were doing the Hatigaon. This is a water cooler, and about 100 get put up in Jaipur. That guy works for the business association that sponsors this. He comes in the morning, he puts out his beautiful brass kettle, and anyone can come, they cup their hand and they drink water, no plastic glasses. It's a very humane gesture, and it's wonderful. They talk for a minute, and they're all over the city of Jaipur. And we got fascinated and started studying this while we were doing Hatigaon. And then he comes out once in a while and humidifies it. So through evaporative cooling, the hut stays cool. So he's very comfortable. Inside the hut, there are matkas, which are earthen but not fired. So they're porous, which means they also through evaporative cooling cool the water. So the water is very cool and it's clean. And he gives them water, and it's a very beautiful gesture. And this was inspirational for us. And so we did a building which was a 5-floor high garden. And it was a garden which was on all the 4 facades. So we said, everyone was using Alico bond and making patterns out of Alico bond. So we said, let's make patterns out of flowers. So we looked at east, west, north. We said what flowers would come where. And we kind of did this pattern. We grew them in the nursery to see what flowers they'd give us. And that became our elevation. And again, the impatience of capital, they wanted to move into the building. So we said, okay, you give us a year or two to grow the facade. You move in. So the cows were called, the pujas were done. They moved into the thing. And we slowly fabricated this trellis using recycled aluminium alloys in a little factory outside the site. So it was about 7 or 8 craftspeople using new materials and kind of creating a new expression from it. And you see it's very rough texture. The idea was that even if the flowers and things didn't grow, the building should have some integrity aesthetically. But anyway, they grew, and this is what the facades look like. It has a misting system, so you can see a little mist there. There's lemongrass and other plants on the podium. People go up to observe birds and flowers. These are people who work there. So there's a podium. You see how lush the flowers have gotten. It also has an atrium. It has different departments. It has a courtyard that takes out the hot air. So it's also articulated carefully within. That building got a LEED certificate. We couldn't get a LEED certificate because our windows weren't sealed, they were openable, except now Greha gives you those options. But that's like the walkie-talkie building that is reflecting more heat and creating the environment to heat up. And we couldn't get anything, but we've been mapping it. Sanjay Prakash, who's a friend, said you should map it. We did mapping. We did this very intuitively. But what's wonderful here is that these are the heroes of the buildings, which are the gardeners. They're the poorest paid employees, but the identity of the corporate office depends on them. And so they're the poor. They would normally have been on their haunches in the lawn, and their boss would have driven by with tinted glasses with no connection. Now they are part of the office. They walk around on the catwalk wherever they go. This is not a stage picture. I would have cleaned the wires. This I think we took one day when we just went to the building. But you see, it's an easy relationship. They don't put the blinds down. There are blinds everywhere for privacy, but no one. They have all befriended the 20 gardeners that work there because they are part of the building is a living organism, and they are part of it. And they're very proud of it. And this is an image intern from Panama City took. It's not even a professional photographer. But that woman, we might or not like the sari, but the fact that she's dressed in whatever she might think is elegant is because those are the bosses in the conference room, and she is one glass away from them. And so it creates a different form of empathy. Martha Chen, who is a Kennedy School of Government professor, and she's an expert on informal economies, she wrote something in the context of economy which really moved me, and I'll just read it out. She said, in a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes humans beings almost a different species. Sorry, I'm reading you the wrong one. I'm reading you Pratap Bhanu Mehta, so give me a minute. Yeah, Martha Chen. She said, what is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players. And so, in a sense, we didn't read this when we did the building. I read it later. But this by default allowed that. That's the hydroponic tray on which they walk. It's all hydroponic, so it's very efficient in terms of water. It doesn't waste a lot of water. And that's what it sort of feels like. This was when it was just completed. So it's not very green. It's a misting system. So the misting system is only to wash the plants, to create atmosphere, to cool it through evaporative cooling. It acts as like a cuss screen. So you keep the plants wet and you open your windows, the air becomes humidified and cool. It's what the cuss we used to use. So that's what the building really does. And this is, so sometimes you can increase it. Sometimes people, then they have visitors, they put on the mist because everyone enjoys the kind of feeling of the mist that comes. And what you see in glass are the conference rooms which give it. This is a more recent image we took. The whole roof is a solar panel. This is in the summer when they don't give it a haircut because they need the insulation, and they let it grow. And then after the summer, where you see some of the blue flowers, they'll give it a haircut, and then it becomes good again. And so it's in the context of buildings, like you see in the background, but that's what it sort of feels like. And so this is a garden they also adopted, so it almost feels like it's coming out of it. The infrastructure company was going to do 2 identical blocks. There had been 2 green buildings, but something went wrong, again, in the politics of Hyderabad, and they couldn't finish that building, so we had only 1 building completed. We took this idea to Switzerland. We were asked to do a building on the Novartis campus along the Rhine River, where we took this idea, where we made a register with Gunther Woh, who is a landscape architect, and it's a register with, I think it's 24 or 28 species, and each one blooms at a different month. So it becomes a register of the season just in terms of what flowers. But it's also where the scientists in this very high-tech lab, it's a robotic lab, the scientists write their findings out in this veranda with the green, so they connect with nature. It's a campus where they've got different architects doing different buildings. We were very lucky to be invited from India, so we have a building on the Rhine, so it overlooks the Rhine River. And that is when it was just finished. You see the last building, other buildings have filled in, the gardens have done. This was an very early view. And it was very interesting going from Mumbai. I realized all the buildings done by really famous architects in the world did a lab with 2 big cores, elevators, everything. They put the scientists between the 2 cores. They put the scientists along the perimeter, and they put the administrative people who had no views, nothing. So what we did was we split the cores, which was to get the Swiss to take a deviation on one building after 24 was like the biggest challenge. But they finally understood our logic, and what we said is by splitting the cores, you'll get a footplate, which we can do many things with. But it's also more efficient because you can organize the building in different ways. That was one, and this is all Bombay tricks. Second was, I said, why, if it's labs and offices, do you need a 4 meter, I don't remember, 3.8 or whatever, for all the spaces? The offices don't need more than 2.4, which is 8. So if you did that and you put more floors where the offices were, we had enough FSI to make a courtyard, because we would use up the FSI in that by making the floor heights less, right? So we got a courtyard. So it was a complete break from all the other buildings on the campus, which essentially took one facade and wrapped it around and had all the floor plates the same. That's a kind of Western paradigm. So I think all the kind of what we call Teen Punch in Mumbai made us think like this differently. How do you get more space? How do you get a courtyard, etc.? And what we did was a building where you see the labs there, the offices are stacked, and there's a courtyard, which is a greenhouse in the center, from where the scientists and the administrators, who are otherwise separated in the hierarchy, they never intermingle, now actually come together in the garden, because the conference rooms are all in the garden and the decks that look over the garden. And that's the rendering of what that garden looks like. So this is the register for the thing. On the Rhine, it's a much more transparent facade, and on the other side it's the green facade, and it's a concrete where we mix the Basel stone in the concrete, so you get this ochre kind of color. And those are some of the plans. You walk through it, you get glimpses of labs for the visitors who go up to the Rhine. And then as you come to the upper level, the administration, which is the lower category because the scientists are higher, they actually sit in the garden, so they get privileged by that. You have views of the Rhine. And then the decks all over the place, including the garden, are the meeting rooms. These are the labs, which are designed by Toshiko Mori, a Japanese architect, who did the interiors of the labs. And this is the garden. Those are the conference rooms. They're all over the place. Those are the labs that are within there. You come out of the elevator, they're meeting rooms. These are flat screen TVs in the garden. So the meetings, the workspaces are in the garden, so the administrators and the scientists. The garden also regulates the heat and the cool in the skylights that open, so it actually traps heat in the winter. So it also is an efficient device. And you see the kind of relationships and the presence of the garden right through the building. So now I move to institutional work and talking about patrons, clients. This was my hardest project, a nightmare at the time it was happening. On the CEP campus, we were given a site, which we were given as part of a master plan that Christopher Benninger made. We couldn't move the building anywhere, and it was a 6-floor program, so we would have landed up doing a 6-story building in a campus that Doshi did. I studied there, so therefore it was very difficult, and so the datums of that were different. Imagine putting a 6-story building behind that. And so what we did was a building that went 3 floors into the ground, so that it maintained all the datums of the Doshi buildings. So we treated it as an intervention in a modern heritage zone. And again, it was a lot of interaction with faculty, students, but also the president of the university, the president of the Ahmedabad. So it was, you become the bridge then between many of these entities, which, having done Hathigam, I realized was the only way to get a successful project. And so we landed up doing this. The building itself is actually 3 nestled cubes, which sit within each other, which have their own logic in terms of heights. One has a logic of a height of 3.8, I think, or 3.2, 3.4. The other is 3 meters, and one is 2.4 meters. And so they're like 3 buildings which have different floor heights that sit within each other. The outer skin regulates the temperature, the climate. The inner skin brings in light, and the third skin houses the books, which go underground. So they have completely different functions and have scales. Now when you go 3 floors under the ground, if it's just 3 basements, you get claustrophobia. But here, because the scales are different, your views are diagonal. So your views get extended diagonally, which means you always feel extended vistas. So that was the idea of nestling it. And so this is how they sit. That's how they managed to create the datum, by going 3 feet, 3 floors under. If you look at a worm's eye view, that's the complexity of the building, of these 3 cubes nestling into each other. And you see the model, so that outer skin is regulating temperature, it's louvers and things. The inner cube is bringing light and spaces, and then you see the innermost thing is the stacks for the library. And all the infrastructure is in the innermost, and so it's concealed within the book stacks itself, so you don't see some of that. And what comes above ground then is just much lighter building which picks up the lines of the existing buildings that were designed by Doshi. So it sits more gently, but yet has its own identity in some ways. So here you see the first skin and the second skin, and these bridges connect them. You see the courtyards going down to take light down, and you see that inner skin of the library. And the first ground floor is being used now for exhibitions, where it was meant to be a space for students to do drawings, to have juries, to do workshops. But now it's become very popular for exhibitions, so there's always display there, etc. And as you go down, the concrete gets lighter. So the concrete color gets whiter as it goes down to also establish the datum, but therefore reflect the light. And the inside is made out of plywood because of budgets, but it can always be reconstructed in another material. It was very inexpensively done, and that's what that inner building feels like. And these are the diagonal views. So you see, you always, wherever you're in the building, you always see some natural light on the diagonal because the slippages of the floors. And so you begin to get these expanded vistas, and you don't feel the fact that you're in a basement, which is always stratified otherwise. When you have parking basements and things, is very claustrophobic. And that's what those skins look like. And this is just a section. So those are the louvers that move and fit, and then you have a concrete base. And that concrete base then goes down. It gets whiter as you go down into the basement. These are the bridges that connect you. And then as you go down to the basement, of course, the light modulates, the concrete gets whiter, and then you have the skylights from which you actually go down one more level. And that's the lowest level, where the skylights just throw light on this concrete wall. Those are the inner buildings, which are the library, which is just 8 feet, so you can reach books very easily. These are carrels around it, which kind of float. And so you see these half levels within that building. So the book stacks and things are much more intimate. And so infrastructure is all within the stacks. And so there are no columns, they're just these portals which support it, and you get this. So it gets more monastic as you go down to the lowest levels, and it gets quieter. And the upper levels are much more luminous, the reading rooms if people want to go up, etc. This is a manual we made of how students could actually modulate it. Unfortunately, it's not happened, and I was there in January. We are trying to revive this with some of the faculty, that the students would get an elective class where they could actually monitor the temperature, set the louvers based on the readings. We've done it in Hindi and Gujarati, which tell you which week, which month, where the louver setting should be for optimum kind of use. And at night it reverses because it's silhouettes. I was there for the first time at the convocation, and talking about tents and attachments of the Mughal buildings. This is something we had planned, of how the building could also serve to attach a shamiana, so you could have the convocation there. And so the building also performs that function. The base becomes intimate for students to sit in. This is the second building we did there, where the building was designed as an armature for a School of Arts and Sciences. So what you see as blank surfaces are ducts and staircases. Everything between it can change, and they're already changing it depending on their requirements because they needed the flexibility. And so it's a building which has an infill, which is of these louvers, glass, green, vines, etc. And that becomes the steady thing, and everything in between changes depending on need by the institute. And the section of the building is much more intricate, and it changes over time at different points. And you see that infill varies. So it gives you maximum sort of flexibility. And there's a kit of parts of elements that make the ground floor much more social for the whole university to go through it. So we use these colors. They're mini amphitheaters. The library sits within it and is identified in the blue of the Brahmins, I guess. There are little amphitheaters all over the place for students to interact and to have spontaneous events. And so the idea there was how you create flexibility but also create intimacy. So the building is an armature, so it's a piece of infrastructure, but then on the ground level you create a sense of intimacy for social interaction. And in Ahmedabad, this is a project for the School of Public Policy at IIM. It's a building for mid-career people who would come and interact with each other. It's a big portal with a ramp, which is like a promenade, and it's about ambiguous space. The faculty cabins are on that side, so it's well organized. The staircase is on this side, and everything in between is very loose, open space for them to gather, to have to set up chairs, to have interactions. And the ramp is like a promenade that connects. That's an amphitheater, which is also the steps to go up to the library, but it can become an amphitheater for about 100 people to gather. There are mini amphitheaters on the upper levels where you can have smaller gathering. It's for IS officers to go for training programs. So it's about ambiguity of space. I talked to you about that plan of Gandhi, which was very inspiring. It's so ambiguous. You don't know what is the inside, what is the outside, what is usable, what is circulation, what is flexible, etc. And it also has this modulation of light. So it's about creating sociability, people bumping into each other, meeting each other, sitting around. And so this is a diagram where we overlap all the ambiguous space on every floor. And so you see on the perimeters you have attributed uses, but in the center it's all very ambiguous sort of space. This is a very recent project we've done, and it's in Alibag, so people can go. It's a museum, it's a private museum for a collector with 500 antiquities. And the challenge again, like the house I showed you, was how do you embed it in a village that is growing? And so we kept it all ground floor. During the pandemic, we added that metal roof because the client wanted a place they could also live. Everyone wanted to live here in the pandemic. But it was otherwise a ground floor museum. And it sits at the scale of the village. In fact, now the village is expanding their houses so that they can overlook the gardens and things like that. And they're selling rooms, garden view and things. But it was meant to, the question was how would you embed it if this village grew around it? And it's done in that way. It's a museum for antiquities. It has no air conditioning at all in the museum. It has a green roof which cools it. It has fans that move the air. It has no windows on the outside. The light is, the whole building is about modulating light, both for security. It has no windows, but also to control the light and to keep the place cool even without air conditioning. So when you enter it, it's very ambiguous. It's enigmatic in that it doesn't tell you what it is. There's a crack in the wall from where you enter. There are antiques that mark that entrance in a subtle way, and there are no windows, as you can see. And when you come closer, there's a marker for a threshold. That otla there is where you really enter the museum. So it's done to the scale which is not intimidating. The villagers yet have processions around it. They have a temple very close by. And that's so just to show you how that crack just opens. And when you go in, it's about, so this is a diagram that shows you the plan, and it's about the modulation of light. So I'm going to show you the first slides where the light is the most. Then you go in and the light diminishes, it becomes dark. Then you have light that appears. Then it gets very dark, it gets even darker there, and then you finally come to a light source. So it's all about modulating light depending on the display. So when you enter it, it's luminous. These were meant for performances. They have music concerts here. They have dance performances here. There's a courtyard that brings shadow. So this gets rearranged through, they've had concert piano concerts, they've had classical music, they've had dance. All of that happens. And these skylights are all actually skylights, but they have integrated exhausts in them. So they're continuously pulling up the hot air. So the exhausts are all within, every skylight is also an exhaust fan. And as you go in, you can see how there are different modulations of light within the display of the museum. The Jain collection and the Indus Valley, which is very precious, becomes extremely dark. And it's lit very carefully, but there's no natural light because that also for the safety of the thing. They are a series of shrine rooms. We made rooms which are the scale of where the shrine would have originally been so that you get a simulation of it. So there are a number of shrine rooms that punctuate the museum where you see the object in the scale of space that it would have really been in. And these are also lit carefully. They are marked but in a contemporary kind of way. And that's the green roof. And on this side, we have a series of ramps which take you up to the house of the owner, and the rest is green. You see the big objects. They're big objects because they have integrated exhaust fans and skylights. So they become like sculptures that sit on the roof. It's all on solar energy, and it incorporates existing trees, and it sits with it's actually much lower than most houses in the village also. So that's the ramp that takes you up. The colors are all from the collection of paintings they have, the extracted colors from that. And the pavilion on top is very light, and it has a view which is the house. These are the staircases that take you back and forth. Again, it's about the modulation of light. I'm going to end with one project which brings me great sorrow. because it's a project that happened but never happened. It's built but not used. It was a project for a crematorium where we were also involved with the NGO to raise. Antim Sanstha was the one who initiated this because they felt the last mile in the operations they did was never successful. We were part of them to design but also to raise money. A lot of money was raised, the buildings were built. The municipality took no interest in it, they never showed up for the meetings. Finally, when the building was handed over to them, we weren't involved in the equipment, but they said the equipment was faulty, they had to change it, they couldn't start the crematorium. So it just has been lying for 2 or 3 years now. It's very sad because we know people who pass, we go there, and we can't go in here because it happens in a really awful facility. This is the Ambedkar crematorium, so it's a non-denominational crematorium, which is an important thing about it. We designed only the building, we weren't involved with the equipment, and I think the NGO and the municipality went into some spat. I've talked to everyone from the Thakres to find out, and everyone blames everyone, so finally we gave up. It's much like that Hathigao project, it's political, I think involves corruption, I don't know what it is, but I just wanted to share it with you in this forum. So, it's a series of drums like this, which again is about the modulation of light. This is when you are full of sorrow with a heavy heart and you're going into the crematorium. And that's what the diagram is. Those are the models. It's a big entry court. The current crematorium is down here, which is just an open thing. And these are 8 pyres with that central area. And there's storage, there's offices, there's places to keep the ash. There's a large entrance court, which would have been the place that family would have gathered before making the procession. These are the moments, that's the entrance court, which never got built, but everything else is built. And these are Gabion walls, and you have trees that were accommodated, and you come in. Those are the names of the donors that you see at the back. And these are the various skylights that modulate light as you kind of go through it. And that's when you enter the area where the cremations happen in these red sort of drums, and that becomes very somber and dark. And then when you go in, the pyre is a solid block of granite where the body is placed before it's put into the electrical crematorium. The furniture and everything is made out of stone. There's no other material, so you can hose it all down to clean it out after a ceremony, so the next group that comes in has it purely more purified. And that's the chamber, these are the numbers. And that's sort of the section, again, it's all about bringing light in, and anyway, so that's what it is. And that's what the inner chambers has courtyards. So at this point where the ceremony is going on and the cremation, light begins to appear as the ceremony is completed. And then when you exit it, it's just flooded with light in a way that you go out, it becomes white and pure, and you leave. So that was the narrative, the intention, but sadly it's things didn't align, and it's a facility that lies, and I haven't presented in Bombay a lot, but it's good to present it so citizens here know something like this could happen. So I just go back to reflections to complete. And so I'm going back to reflections because everything I talked to you about theory and archiving, etc., now comes a full end, and these are many of the books that one has done. And it's now about reflecting what all this means. And so I've been trying to organize it and see what are the books that actually were important for my practice, what were the things that we did advocacy, what was purely research and pedagogy, studios, things like that. And how does one make sense of all of this? Because these were different endeavors. And so one is trying mapping them to issues and to ideas like constructing significance, instruments of advocacy, which are the books that I could say began to talk about Mumbai in some ways that changed legislation, or we changed the questions in pedagogy. So one is trying to understand these patterns, and I'm in the process of doing that. But I just wanted to say that what I started with is now something that I'm trying to make sense of. And it really makes me think about the difference between the practice of architecture and the architecture of practice. And I think we need to rethink the architecture of practice. And I'll just use some words to summarize, and I'll end in a minute. So can architecture in a time of flux, or the architecture of transitions, be cultivated? Can this be taught? Is it about learning, research involved in architecture, or the surpluses of knowledge that architectural projects generate rather than begin with? And so what I shared with you in Hatigao and understanding things it's knowledge that for me was generated at the end of the project. I didn't have that knowledge when I started, and therefore one feels compelled to share it. And that's why I think archiving and research and writing becomes important, because I believe we don't do enough of that. Then it's truly about the multiplicity in terms of concerns, modes of engagement, and more importantly, modes by which ideas are let out in the world to gain agency, to become the places in which life inhabits the planet, creating an architecture that looks outwards to embrace the context in the broadest sense and negotiates the context in all its diverse complexities. And that's what I mean by the context of the context. This process, I believe, is not linear, but one that is imagined as a matrix to operate within. Thus, if we were to respond to the provocation of multiplicity and the investigation of forces that generate uncertainty and change in contemporary architecture, we must articulate a position that rejects the celebration of the practice of architecture and aspires to constructing an architecture practice relevant to grapple with the challenges of the future. An architecture of practice that makes the shift to transitionary thinking, which makes central the idea of interconnectedness of social, economic, political, and natural systems by accepting them in flux. It brings, and that's why time becomes important, it brings a shift in the culture of practice to respond to the uncertainties that surround us by embracing a multiplicity of modes and operating in a framework or armature in which research extends into pedagogy and the making of buildings embraces advocacy as being integral to the process of production. Similarly, I think pedagogy must change to address the world around us and equip practitioners to intervene. It must change as quickly as the world and the theory that otherwise limits its own formulation. In both architecture and art, I think this is true. They are often in art and architecture, and especially architecture, but I think art too, they are judged by three parameters. Novelty, that is, we say how original is the work. Nuance, which is how difficult were they to make, often judged in terms of technique. This happens in art too. And narrative, that is, what are the conversations and views of the world that they opened up and changed. We must not be obsessed with novelty, but pay more emphasis on how we can be, as I said, the thermostat and not the thermometers, ones that change the temperature to make for more inclusive environments and by extension societies that are inclusive. For it is through that change in society that architecture will have the agency to celebrate that critical condition and bring together two distinct but deeply interconnected dimensions of human existence: personal fulfillment versus collective well-being. I think this is a big crisis in our society today. While the good life focuses on individual happiness, virtue, and purpose, the good society provides the structural framework, justice, and community necessary for those individual pursuits to flourish. And I think that is really the agency of architecture, finally. Thank you.